The world always begins with silence before the storm. For Charles, that silence felt heavy, almost unbearable, as if the weight of unseen forces pressed down on his chest. He could not name it, not yet, but it wrapped around him like a fog. The church bells of Shrewsbury tolled in the distance, steady and indifferent, while he sat with a notebook on his lap, the pages trembling beneath his hands. Something vast and dangerous stirred inside him, though no one else seemed to notice. He had been raised to believe that creation was ordered, stable, and eternal, yet every beetle, every stone, every fossil he turned over whispered otherwise. The whispers unsettled him. They carried the promise of discovery but also the threat of exile. Even in his youth, when his curiosity should have been a harmless trait, there was a sense that he was wandering toward forbidden ground. The world around him was content with certainty. Charles's mind was already straying into mysteries that promised anything but peace. He remembered the first time he caught himself stealing away into the woods behind his home, pressing his ear close to the earth as if the soil itself might tell him its secrets. He had never confessed it to anyone, not even his family, but at those moments he felt as if he were trespassing into realms that were not meant to be touched by human thought. Every insect crawling over a leaf, every strange pattern on a fossil shell, seemed alive with a question he could not escape. The danger did not lie in the beetle or the fossil itself. It lay in what those objects implied, a possibility so immense it threatened to unmake the world he had been taught to believe in. Even then, fear was his companion. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being right. Fear that in asking questions, he would find answers no one wanted. He hid those fears behind a calm exterior, behind the boy who went about his studies dutifully, but beneath the surface he felt hunted by his own thoughts. Each question clawed closer, like footsteps following in the dark, waiting for him to turn and acknowledge what chased him. When he was sent to Edinburgh to study medicine, he thought perhaps the distraction of anatomy and lectures might quiet the pursuit. But the lecture halls smelled of blood and chemicals, and the demonstrations turned his stomach. The cries of patients under the surgeon's knife were not the cries of certainty. They were the sounds of suffering, of life and death tangled in ways no doctrine could explain. Charles slipped out of those rooms whenever he could, retreating once again to the wilderness, where the air was damp with salt and the tide washed bones and shells onto the shore. It was there he felt the chase resume, stronger, clearer. And still, he told no one. Not his professors, not his family, not even his closest friends. The danger was not yet ripe, but it waited, gathering strength with each observation, each note scribbled in the margins of his books. When he transferred to Cambridge, his outward life seemed calmer: hymns, theology, long walks with friends. Yet inside, the fog pressed closer, suffocating, promising revelation but demanding sacrifice. Sometimes he dreamed of it, standing on the edge of an abyss, the ground crumbling beneath him, voices rising from the depths. They did not call his name. They whispered instead of patterns, of laws, of connections between creatures that should have been unrelated. In those dreams, he wanted to run, but his legs rooted him in place. He awoke drenched in sweat, notebook clutched to his chest, as if by holding it close he could shield himself from what he had already written inside. There was no shield. The pursuit would not stop. It had followed him from the fields of Shrewsbury to the lecture halls of Edinburgh, to the quiet chapels of Cambridge. It whispered in the cry of gulls, in the fossilized shells that crumbled between his fingers, in the cold, glassy stare of pinned beetles in his collection. And always the same question returned, circling him, relentless. What if the world was not fixed at all? What if life itself moved beneath the surface like tides, rising and falling, shifting shape, defying the certainty of creation? Charles did not yet know how dangerous that question was. He only knew that it left him restless, unable to breathe in the safe air of dogma. He carried it with him as others carry a wound, concealed but never forgotten, and it throbbed whenever he least expected it. The danger was not a predator waiting in the dark. The danger was inside him already, a seed pressing against the shell, desperate to break free. And though he did not say it aloud, though he did not yet dare to name it, he knew the moment was coming when the silence would shatter, and the storm would arrive. The ocean has a way of swallowing men whole, not just their bodies but their certainty. Charles gripped the rail of the Beagle until his knuckles whitened, the salt wind lashing against his face, the horizon stretching endlessly into an emptiness that felt less like freedom and more like a trial. He had thought he knew what he was stepping into when he boarded the ship, But already there was a sense of being trapped inside something larger than himself, something that could not be measured by compass or map. The voyage was meant to be opportunity. Adventure, science, exploration. At least, that was how it had been spoken of in drawing rooms and over polished tables back in England. But the reality was different. The sea rolled with moods that shifted without warning, violent storms cracking the sky one moment, a deceitful calm smothering the next. Charles lay awake at night in his cramped cabin, his body tossed against the walls by waves, listening to the groaning timbers of the ship as though it were alive, as though it resented him. Sometimes he wondered if he had boarded willingly, or if he had been lured, caught in a net spun by forces he didn't yet understand. There was danger here, not the kind that came with muskets or knives, but the kind that whispered from the natural world itself. On shore, he found bones embedded in cliffs, creatures that no longer existed, yet whose shapes mocked the animals still walking the earth. He turned them over in his hands, the weight both exhilarating and terrifying. If these beings had once lived and then vanished, what guarantee was there that life, any life, could be permanent? Each fossil was a crack in the foundation of certainty, and Charles felt himself standing on ground that shifted beneath his boots. The sailors noticed the strangeness in him. They laughed at his beetle jars, at the piles of notes he scribbled long into the night, at the way he wandered beaches alone, crouching over shells as though they contained treasure. But Charles did not care for their laughter. What unsettled him was not their mockery but the growing realization that his notes were leading him somewhere he was not ready to go. His pen scratched faster with every discovery, as if trying to keep pace with a truth racing ahead of him. He feared that when he caught it, he would not be able to look it in the eye. On the Galapagos Islands, the danger sharpened. He examined finches with beaks of every shape, some thin, some broad, each suited to a different food. The birds should have been kin, but they behaved like strangers, each adapted to its own island as though sculpted by an invisible hand. Charles felt the prickle at the back of his neck, the same sensation as when walking alone at night and realizing you are being followed. The world seemed to be hiding something from him, taunting him with clues scattered across sand and stone, daring him to assemble them into a picture that could not be unseen. Even the landscapes carried menace. Volcanoes rose out of the ocean, black and raw, as if the earth itself had been ripped open. Lava fields stretched barren and lifeless, then, without warning, burst into sudden bursts of color where strange plants clung to survival. Life here did not follow the rules he had been taught. It shifted, adapted, twisted itself into forms that defied expectation. Each step he took felt like trespass, as though he were walking into nature's hidden workshop, where secrets too dangerous for mankind were forged. At night, he dreamed of the creatures he had collected, their glassy eyes staring back at him, accusing him of knowing too much. He woke drenched in sweat, the sound of waves hammering against the ship like a relentless heartbeat. Sometimes he wondered if the Beagle itself was carrying him toward revelation or ruin, dragging him across oceans against his will. The voyage was no longer an adventure. It was a test, and failure meant more than disgrace. It meant never returning the same. He kept his fears buried in his journal. Page after page filled with sketches, measurements, and observations, but between the lines a shadow crept. Each entry grew heavier, not with ink but with the weight of implication. He was assembling a puzzle without permission, and once complete, it would not be him alone who faced its consequences. He knew, deep down, that this knowledge, if spoken aloud, would ignite storms fiercer than any the sea had thrown at him. The sailors, the captain, even the friends he had left behind in England, they could not see it yet. They saw a young man obsessed with rocks and birds. They did not see the dangerous path unfolding beneath his notes. Charles himself barely understood it, only that he was walking further from safety with every fossil he picked up, every beak he examined, every word he wrote. And still he could not stop. Even if it destroyed him, he could not stop. The ocean stretched endlessly ahead, and with each wave he felt the same truth pressing closer, as inescapable as the tide. Something was waiting for him, something vast, patient, and merciless. He did not yet know its name, but he felt it coiling around him like the sea wind, ready to tighten when the moment came. The bones did not belong to anything he recognized, and that terrified him. Charles knelt in the hot dust of the pampas, brushing soil from the curve of a skull too massive, too alien, to fit into the neat categories he had been taught. It was a beast that no longer walked the earth, a ghost staring at him from the ground, daring him to explain why it had lived once and why it lived no longer. The sailors laughed when he tried to haul fragments back to the Beagle, but their laughter could not drown the unease that gripped him. What law of nature allowed such giants to vanish while armadillos scurried in their place? The danger was not in the fossils themselves, but in what they implied, a history older and more violent than Scripture admitted. He felt it as a tightening in his chest, as though he were standing too close to a door he should not open, hearing strange movements on the other side. Every bone was a knock, steady, patient, and growing louder. He knew that once the door gave way, it would never close again. The voyage pressed him deeper into this labyrinth of questions. In tangled forests, he chased beetles that evaded capture as if mocking his hunger for order. On barren shores, he found shells far above sea level, evidence that the earth itself shifted and groaned in ways men could not see. Each discovery was a riddle without an answer, but the pattern forming in his mind felt less like chance and more like a whisper leading him toward a forbidden conclusion. He wanted to turn away, but he could not. The pull was stronger than fear. At night, the ship's cabin became a prison of thoughts. He lay awake as waves slapped the hull, his notes stacked beside him, each page a silent accusation. He imagined the fossils and the finches gathered in the dark, waiting for him to admit what he already suspected. Their shapes blurred in his dreams, ancient bones fusing with living creatures, transformations unfolding before his eyes. He awoke gasping, the lamp flickering, unsure if he had seen visions or truths. The boundaries between observation and nightmare were dissolving. Captain Fitzroy, with his stern convictions, spoke of Providence guiding their path. His words clashed against the storm inside Charles's head. Providence implied design, stability, finality. Yet the evidence in his hands screamed of upheaval, of life rising and falling without mercy or plan. The captain's faith was iron, but iron rusts. Charles wondered what would happen if his own thoughts ever surfaced, if the captain, or anyone, discovered what hunted him. The danger was no longer distant. It traveled with him, hidden in his satchels, folded into his notebooks, carried like contraband. The Galapagos returned to him in fragments, as if the islands themselves haunted him. The birds with their shifting beaks, the tortoises with their shells shaped by their home terrain, images that refused to let go. They followed him across the ocean, shadows perched on his shoulder, whispering of a truth so simple and so devastating he almost wished he had never seen them. He wanted to tell someone, to speak aloud the puzzle tightening around him, but silence felt safer. To speak would be to invite judgment, and judgment was a storm fiercer than any gale. Still, his silence did not spare him from the chase. In the markets of South America, he saw slaves in chains and wondered if humanity itself bore marks of transformation. The thought struck him like lightning, dangerous, blasphemous. He recoiled, yet it lingered, smoldering in the corners of his mind. If species could change, could people? The question gnawed at him until he could barely write without his hand trembling. He began to collect obsessively, as if sheer quantity could shield him from doubt. Bones, skins, plants, rocks, his cabin filled with fragments of a world unraveling. But the more he gathered, the less safe he felt. The pieces did not comfort, they accused. They conspired. They assembled themselves into patterns he tried desperately not to recognize. Each object was a thread, and together they were weaving a tapestry of upheaval, a story of life that did not fit within the frame of certainty. Storms battered the ship, lightning splitting the sky, but Charles scarcely noticed. The greater storm roared inside him, a tide that would not ebb. He stood on deck, rain streaming down his face, staring into the black horizon and feeling as though the ocean itself demanded an answer from him. The water stretched endless, merciless, reminding him that man was small, fragile, fleeting. It was not faith that kept the ship afloat. It was chance, balance, adaptation. He knew it in his bones, though he dared not name it. Every day pressed him closer to the edge. He felt it when he wrote, when he collected, when he stared too long at the endless sea. The voyage was changing him, reshaping him in ways he could not resist. He was no longer simply observing nature. He was being pulled into its hidden laws, forced to confront a truth vast enough to undo everything he had ever believed. And still the question stalked him, patient, relentless, waiting for him to turn and face it fully. What if the world was not created to remain still? What if life itself was a storm, and he had already stepped into its eye? The silence of home was louder than the storms of the sea. When Charles stepped back onto English soil, he expected relief, a return to safety, but instead he felt the weight of his discoveries pressing harder, as though the land itself demanded explanations he was not ready to give. Friends and family saw a young naturalist flushed with success, but inside, he carried the bones of vanished beasts, the birds with impossible beaks, and the whispers of an idea too dangerous to voice. Every drawing room, every lecture hall, every polite dinner became a stage where he played a part: the dutiful son, the promising scholar, the gentleman traveler. Yet beneath the surface, the storm raged. He wrote, revised, filled journals with endless notes, each line a quiet betrayal of the world around him. He told himself it was preparation, caution, prudence. But it felt like hiding contraband, as though each word he said on paper smuggled danger into the heart of England itself. The danger was not in discovery, but in exposure. Each specimen he unpacked carried more than curiosity. It carried implications that clawed at the foundations of faith and society. Clergymen praised him for his devotion to cataloging creation, never suspecting that his eyes no longer saw creation as fixed. Every polite nod, every handshake from men of the cloth, was a reminder of the abyss yawning at his feet. He smiled at them, thanked them, but the smile felt like a mask hiding a secret too monstrous to confess. Nights grew longer, filled with the scratch of his pen and the restless turning of his body in bed. He dreamed of the fossils rising from their crates, towering over him, their jaws wide as though ready to devour him for daring to ignore their message. He dreamed of the finches with shifting beaks circling above him like omens, their wings beating out a rhythm that whispered of change, transformation, survival. He woke gasping, heart pounding, drenched in sweat, but the dreams never left him. They trailed him into the daylight, haunting his every step. The walls of his study felt close, too close, as if the house itself was pressing in. He tried to busy himself with smaller studies, barnacles, pigeons, plants, hoping the details would distract him from the storm. But even there the truth lurked. Pigeons bred into countless forms, barnacles showing variations beyond imagination, plants bending and twisting toward survival. No matter where he turned, nature repeated the same sinister refrain: nothing is fixed, everything shifts. It was a message too consistent to ignore, and yet too dangerous to proclaim. There were moments he considered abandoning it all, burning the notebooks, burying the evidence, walking back into the safety of silence. But the danger was no longer outside him, it had taken root within. The questions would not leave, no matter how deeply he tried to push them down. He carried them like a sickness, a fever that flared hotter with each observation. To abandon the search would not cure him. It would only consume him in another way, rotting him from within. Family gatherings offered no refuge. Conversations of marriage, children, and church obligations clashed against the storm inside his head. His relatives spoke of stability, of faith, of tradition. Charles nodded, answered politely, but felt himself drifting further away with every word. He wondered if they could sense it, if his silence betrayed the secret burning in him. Sometimes he caught their eyes lingering on him, curious, puzzled, as though they sensed a shadow moving just behind his gaze. The danger grew sharper when he thought of faith. He had been raised in its embrace, comforted by its promises. But now, with each fossil, each adaptation, each variation scribbled in his notebooks, he felt faith slipping through his fingers like sand. What remained was not comfort but a void, deep and cold, staring back at him whenever he tried to pray. He wanted to believe still, to reconcile the storm with the sanctuary, but the two collided with a violence that left him torn and trembling. He began to avoid certain questions in conversation, steering words carefully as though the wrong syllable might open the door he was desperately trying to keep shut. The danger was not only that he might lose his standing, his respect, his family's pride. The danger was that he might unravel the very fabric that held society together. He feared what might happen if others saw what he saw, if they too began to question the permanence of creation. It was not simply his burden, it was a fire that, once lit, could not be contained. And yet the fire grew, fed by every observation, every specimen, every restless night. He stood at the edge of something vast, knowing that once he stepped forward there would be no retreat. The world would change, and with it, so would he. He feared that the moment was approaching faster than he could prepare for, as inevitable as the tide. He told himself he had time, that he could delay, study more, gather more proof. But in the silence of his study, with his notes piled high around him like walls, he felt the truth pressing closer, whispering that time was an illusion. The storm was here already, and he was standing in its center, waiting for the winds to tear everything apart. The letter was a knife. Charles held it in trembling hands, the words of Alfred Russel Wallace burning into his eyes, each sentence slicing through the silence he had guarded for 20 years. The shock was not only in the resemblance to his own hidden theory. It was in the realization that the storm he had tried to contain had already broken loose elsewhere. Wallace, far across the world, had followed the same trail of bones and beaks, and now the truth Charles had buried in notebooks threatened to emerge from another man's pen. The danger was no longer a phantom whisper in the corners of his study. It stood before him in ink, undeniable, demanding an answer. If Wallace published first, Darwin would be exposed not as a discoverer but as a coward who concealed the greatest secret nature had ever offered. Yet if Darwin moved too quickly, he risked unleashing an idea that could shake the foundations of faith, family, and society. He stared at the letter, caught between ruin and revelation, and felt the walls of his house close in like a trap. He thought of Emma, his wife, her gentle faith like a candle in the dark. How could he place this storm into her hands, knowing it might snuff out that light? He thought of his children, innocent of the weight he carried. What legacy would he leave them, pride in a father's discovery, or shame in a father's heresy? The danger coiled tighter, not only around him but around everyone he loved. Silence had protected them for years, but silence was no longer possible. The storm had found another voice. Nights became unbearable. He wandered his study in shadows, surrounded by mountains of notes that stared back like witnesses. Each page whispered the same truth: the world is not fixed. Species shift, adapt, vanish. Life is a current, not a statue. He had known it for years, feared it, resisted it, but now the current surged too strong to resist. Wallace's letter was the tide rising to sweep away his excuses. He clutched his notes to his chest as though holding them close could slow the flood. His mind turned to the Linnean Society, the scholars who gathered to celebrate order and stability in the natural world. Would they see his theory as light or as blasphemy? Would they brand him a visionary or a traitor? The thought of standing before them with his words laid bare sent a chill through him, yet the alternative, silence, surrender, erasure, was worse. Wallace had forced his hand. The knife had cut deep, and now the wound demanded a response. The days that followed were fevered. He wrote with a frantic urgency, piecing together fragments of decades into a coherent weapon, not of violence but of truth. Each sentence felt like stepping deeper into forbidden ground. He could hear the storm gathering outside his window, in the whispers of colleagues, in the shifting of his own heart. It was no longer a matter of if but when. And yet, beneath the fever, terror remained. He imagined priests condemning him from pulpits, newspapers branding him a destroyer of morality, friends turning cold. He imagined Emma's eyes, filled with hurt, unable to reconcile the man she loved with the heretic he might become. The danger was everywhere, in the streets, in the parlors, in the very air he breathed. He carried it like a shadow that could not be outrun. When at last the decision was made, his theory to be read alongside Wallace's at the Linnean Society, he felt not relief but dread. It was as though a clock had begun to strike, each toll a warning that nothing could be undone. He pictured the scholars gathered, their faces stiff with expectation, and wondered what silence would follow when his words were spoken aloud. Would the world erupt? Would it collapse? Or would it ignore him, dismiss him, leave him stranded with a truth too heavy to bear alone? The night before, he sat in his study, the lamp flickering low, the house asleep around him. He laid his hand on the pile of papers, the distilled essence of his life's torment, and listened to the silence pressing in. It was the same silence that had haunted him since the forests of South America, the silence before the storm. He realized then that the storm was no longer something to fear, it was already here. The letter had been the knife, but the wound it opened was the path forward. There was no retreat, no safety in shadows. The dangerous question he had carried for so long would soon step into the world, and with it everything would change. He closed his eyes, not with peace but with grim resolve, and waited for the tolling of the final bell. The first sound was not applause but silence, heavy and suffocating, after his words had been read aloud. Charles was not there in person. Illness had kept him away, but he felt the weight of that silence all the same, as if it pressed through the walls of his house and settled on his chest. For years he had feared this moment, and now that it had arrived, it felt less like triumph and more like standing on the edge of a precipice with nothing but darkness below. The danger was no longer hidden in notebooks or buried in crates of specimens. It had been spoken aloud, carried into the air, impossible to recall. He imagined the faces of the men in that room, scholars in stiff coats shifting uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting, mouths tight. Did they sense it? Did they feel the ground moving beneath them, the foundations trembling with the weight of his idea? Or did they cling to silence, unwilling to name the storm now crackling in their midst? News spread quickly beyond the society. Whispers in drawing rooms, sharp debates in lecture halls, sermons from pulpits. Charles felt them before he heard them, like a tremor running through the earth, each rumor a reminder that he had unleashed something he could not control. He tried to picture the words on strangers' tongues. Darwin says species change. Darwin says creation is not fixed. Darwin says we are not what we believed we were. He shivered, though the fire burned in the grate beside him. Letters arrived, some filled with praise, others dripping with contempt. Friends congratulated him, but their words carried an unease that was hard to miss, as if they were offering respect to a man who had opened a door they were afraid to look through. Enemies condemned him outright, calling him reckless, godless, a destroyer of order. Each letter was a blade, slicing deeper into his isolation. Even Emma's eyes, kind though they were, sometimes lingered on him with worry, as if she wondered whether the storm he had conjured would consume them all. Charles paced the halls of his home like a prisoner awaiting judgment. The applause and the condemnations blurred together until he could no longer tell which was more dangerous. Praise could elevate him into the light, but light attracted enemies. Condemnation could tear him down, but it might also confirm that he had touched a truth too sharp to be ignored. Every step forward felt like stepping deeper into a labyrinth with no clear exit. The storm outside grew louder. Newspapers seized on the controversy, twisting his words into weapons. Cartoons mocked him, sermons thundered against him, and yet, everywhere, the idea spread. Students debated in taverns, naturalists argued over specimens, theologians scrambled for responses. The world was on fire with his dangerous thought, and he was trapped at the center, unable to escape. He had wanted time, patience, caution, but the idea no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the storm. He tried to retreat into the details, into the comfort of his barnacles and pigeons, but even there he found no refuge. Every variation, every adaptation only confirmed what he already knew. Nature echoed his theory in endless voices, relentless, merciless. He could not close his eyes to it. The evidence surrounded him, pressed into him, demanded acknowledgement. What terrified him most was not that others doubted, but that nature itself never did. Nights brought no peace. Dreams of shifting shapes haunted him, men turning into apes, apes into shadows, shadows into the bones of creatures long dead. He awoke drenched in sweat, Emma's hand on his shoulder, her whisper urging him to rest. But rest was impossible. The storm had entered his sleep as surely as it had entered the waking world. He wondered often what the conclusion would be. Would his name be cursed, erased from memory, spat upon as a blasphemer? Or would it be carried forward as a beacon, a man who tore the veil from nature's deepest secret? He could not know. The danger lay not in the past but in the unfolding future, a future rushing toward him like the sea's unrelenting tide. And yet, despite the terror, despite the isolation and the endless weight of judgment, he felt something else rising within him. Not relief, not triumph, but a grim certainty. The storm was no longer a choice. It was the truth. And though the world raged, though his own soul trembled, he knew the idea could not be unspoken. It had passed beyond him now, into the minds of men and women across the globe, and no force could pull it back into silence. He stood by the window in the dead of night, watching the wind tear through the trees, the sky flashing with distant lightning. His body was weak, his hands unsteady, but his eyes were clear. The storm was here, fierce and unending, and he was standing in its heart. Whether it would destroy him or carry his name into eternity, he could not tell. But he no longer feared its arrival. The silence had broken. The world would never be the same. Death walked beside him long before it finally came. Charles felt it in the tremor of his hands, in the weakness of his body, in the cough that rattled his chest at night. Yet the greater shadow was not illness, but the question that had stalked him for a lifetime. Even as his body weakened, the storm he had unleashed grew louder in the world beyond his study. The danger was no longer confined to whispers in halls or arguments in newspapers. It lived in the minds of men, spreading, mutating, just as life itself did. And he knew, even at the edge of his days, that the storm was only beginning. He tried to find refuge in the small things: the touch of Emma's hand, the laughter of his children, the quiet of his garden. But the garden itself betrayed him. Every flower, every insect, every shifting shadow among the trees reminded him of the truth he had named. Variation, adaptation, survival, the great current of life pulsed around him, undeniable, insistent. Even as he longed for peace, the earth would not let him forget. It pressed his own theory into him until his dying breath. The danger now was not discovery, it was legacy. He feared what others would make of his words, how they would twist them into weapons. He had seen it already. Men using his theory to justify cruelty, others to deny faith, still others to crown themselves masters of a law they barely understood. He had not written to destroy, but to reveal. Yet the storm did not answer to him anymore. It moved on its own, sweeping across nations, reshaping thought, tearing down altars, building new ones. He wondered if he had released a truth or a curse. Sometimes, in the still hours of the night, he doubted himself. What if he had erred? What if the storm was nothing but illusion, a terrible mirage that would collapse under the weight of time? The thought gnawed at him, though the evidence had never wavered. The bones, the birds, the plants, the endless variations, they had spoken clearly enough. Still, a man facing death cannot silence the small voice that asks, "What if you were wrong?" Perhaps it was not only death beside him but doubt, waiting to have the last word. And yet, I cannot help but think that he was right to tremble. To open the door he opened was to step into a realm that no man could fully control. Knowledge is never safe. It does not bend to our intentions. It grows wild, unpredictable, like the very life it seeks to explain. Darwin may have written with caution, with patience, but once his words left his desk, they belonged to the storm. That is the danger of truth. It never stays where you put it. I believe that in those final days he felt both the terror and the awe of that realization. He had not ended the mystery. He had only deepened it. He had shown that life is not a statue but a river, flowing endlessly, cutting new paths through stone, sweeping everything along with it. To glimpse that river is to lose the comfort of certainty. And yet, perhaps, to lose certainty is the beginning of seeing the world as it truly is. When he was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, among kings and poets and scientists, the storm did not end. It roared on, through arguments, through discoveries, through wars and revolutions. His body was still, but his idea was alive, more alive than ever, carrying with it the same danger, the same promise, the same relentless whisper: everything changes. I think of him often, not as a figure carved in marble, but as a man pacing his study at night, torn between fear and necessity, caught in a storm he could not control. That is the Charles who lingers, not the triumphant discoverer, but the haunted seeker, who dared to ask questions too vast for comfort. The danger he faced was not the hostility of others, nor even the collapse of belief. It was the unending weight of truth itself. And perhaps that is what remains most terrifying of all. The storm did not die with him. It lives in us, in the questions we still fear to ask, in the truths we hesitate to face. Darwin's life is a reminder that the greatest dangers are not outside us, but within the thoughts we dare not silence. He walked with that danger until the end, and in walking with it, he became part of the storm.